So thanks for coming out. Thanks, Denise. I'm presenting Hannah Elliott's work. So Hannah is a master's student of mine, or sorry, an honor student of mine. She took one of my courses a couple of years back that was alternatively graded. And she told me when she saw the syllabus for the first time, she said, why am I going to do any work? There's no grades. But yet at the end of it, she was more motivated than she ever had been with grades. So that sparked in her a desire to ask the question, which is essentially, what is the impact of assessment method on student motivation for learning? And when we're talking about assessment method, Hannah was comparing traditional grading to alternate grading or alternative grading. So I'm going to just start with some really brief definitions of these two things, and I'm going to talk about these a bit more tomorrow in the keynote. So traditional grading is what we're sort of all used to, and what we've been in school for a while. This is how we've been graded: multiple timed assessments and/or assignments that have a grade at the end, usually with minimal opportunity for revision and resubmission, and all of those grades get added up in some mathematical average to give you your mark at the end. The research is conclusive that in classes like this, grades are the primary driver of student motivation, right? And I've given you Chamberlain, but there's many other authors who've said the same thing. And Hannah recognized this in herself coming into my course. There's lots of issues with traditional grades, and I'll just touch on these briefly. They certainly increase anxiety due to grading. They can impact sleep and other health markers due to the stress that grades create for some students. Some of that stress is due to that expectation to maintain outstanding grades. So much of what we do after our schooling is dependent on the grade. What job do you get? What school do you get into? What graduate school do you get into? What scholarships do you get? It's all dependent on the grades. Grades also encourage superficial learning, primarily because of the last one. Learning is focused on what's expected to appear on the assessment, right? If I know I'm not going to be tested on it, then I'm not going to worry about it. It can also cause students to favor simple tasks, right? What course can I do to get a good grade, as opposed to the course that's going to be really challenging, right? So there's lots of issues with traditional grading, which has led to this alternate to traditional grading, which is alternate grading or alternative grading. I was looking for a good definition of this, and really alternate grading is almost anything other than traditional grading. But some key fundamental aspects of alternate grading are meaningful feedback, and then the opportunity to use that meaningful feedback for resubmissions or revisions of student work. So there's learning through that process of feedback. And then also in many types of alternate grading, students can have some involvement in collaborating on what that final grade is. So that's just a brief snapshot of what alternate grading is. So these were Hannah's two research questions. What happens to student motivation when grades are no longer assigned in the traditional manner? And then the second piece, how does student motivation differ if we compare motivation between traditionally graded and alternately graded course? So those were our research questions. What did we do to look at this? We used a survey methodology. We surveyed two classes, and I'll describe those two classes in just a bit. Hannah did this during winter 2024. We surveyed them twice, the beginning of the semester, at the end of the semester. She used the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire to assess motivation for learning. And the end of term survey, we also included an additional qualitative question to get the students to talk to us a little bit more about that link between assessment and learning. And then we compared all of those differences for the quantitative data using a two-way ANOVA. The Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire gave us measures of six topics. We're really just going to talk about intrinsic motivation for learning and extrinsic motivation for learning. The rest of them we haven't really finished any analysis with them yet. So we're gonna focus on the intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, and we'll define what those are when I get into the results. Who completed the survey? So I teach in human kinetics and recreation. I should have told you that. So we picked 2 senior year classes, so 4th year classes. One was traditionally graded. This was an advanced exercise physiology class, not that it matters. And the assessment was 2 midterms and a final exam. That was it. And then the alternately graded class was a class that I teach, which used totally ungraded labs. So there were no grades for the labs at all. And I'll talk about that tomorrow in my keynote. There was open book tests that focused on problem solving and critical thinking. So I was trying to move away from the regurgitation piece. There was small group learning, a lot of collaborative types of learning, and there was an infographic project that used sort of formative assessment and feedback and time to revise and resubmit. So those were the 2 classes that we surveyed. What did we find? We found no differences in motivation. So these are the intrinsic motivation scores. So intrinsic motivation, students engage in academic activities because they're interested in learning, right? That's what's driving their push to succeed, is they just really love learning. So these scores show traditional versus alternately graded. We collapse them. So this is just pre versus post. There was no difference. Extrinsic motivation. So they're motivated by something outside of their self. And in most cases, that thing outside can be getting good grades, but it can also be getting scholarship, right? So there's many types of extrinsic motivation. Again, there was no difference between the groups. The extrinsic motivation, our students were slightly more extrinsically motivated, which is fairly typical. But again, those differences weren't significant. So then we looked at what the students said. And we just, because of the nature of the ethics review we just got access to the qualitative data on the day grades were released. So we've only had it for about a week. So we haven't really been able to analyze it in great detail. But students seem to be split, okay, in their opinions on the 2 assessment methods. There was a cohort of them who quite liked traditional grading. I like only having midterms, quizzes, and a final. I really enjoyed this approach, and it helped me have a better understanding. And there was a group equally as big, I would say, who preferred the alternate grading. I really enjoyed the labs, and I found that they actually helped us learn rather than getting a report done to get a good grade. Every time I left the lab, I felt like I'd learned something new. Someone else talked about how the course focuses on learning. It focuses on learning, which I enjoy a lot. So what does this all mean? So I guess on the positive side, playing with the assessment method, removing grades from a large portion of the course didn't decrease motivation. Okay, so that was a positive, but that was contrary to what others have found. And there's really only been 2 studies that have sort of looked at motivation, Chamberlain and Spurlock. And both of those authors have found increases, particularly in intrinsic motivation with ungraded courses in particular. So why the contradictory findings? Well, the first piece that we really think contributed, these were 2 very different courses with 2 very different instructors. Advanced exercise physiology, advanced biomechanics. Not everybody likes them. The way I teach, the way the other course teaches, were very different. So we sort of were, I think some of what we saw was sort of a blurring of what the differences actually were. And we lost, I think, some of the focus on the effectiveness by having the 2 and making the 2 courses so different. The alternately graded course still had some traditionally graded components. So the infographic, for example, was very much traditionally graded, although we did provide feedback and there was room for resubmission and whatnot. There was still some traditionally graded components in that. The final piece was we had some issues with Qualtrics data that meant that we couldn't actually do the types of repeated measures ANOVA analysis that we really wanted to do to really track differences in how individual students may have changed over the course of the semester in relation to the impact of that assessment on their learning. So what's next? So this is our starting point. Alternate grading changes the student experience. I've seen that. Hannah saw that as a student, which is what encouraged her to do this research. There's many questions. There's no real research out there. Aside from Spurlick and Chamberlain, the research on the impact on motivation is relatively sparse. So our first step is to replicate the study to address some of the limitations that we talked about. And also another thing that we really want to start to look at is students in this situation had two very different learning experiences, two very different assessment methods. And how do they manage the conflict between those two? Midterm, final. Study, regurgitate, and tell me what you know. Reflect, engage. It creates some conflict for the student. I know it does. I see one of my students smiling down there, so I know. So we're gonna talk about that. And Denise is over there waving at me. So we'll stop there. And all.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes for questions for Jeannette. So anyone have
This is not a question, but can you turn off the front row?
a front row of lights? Yes. Anyone else have a question? Okay, I'm going to ask you to use the microphone so our online. Can you hear me?
Is this?
Yes, that's right.
Hi, thanks for that.
Mhm.
I'm wondering two things might be connected.
Yep.
One is you did your study in fourth year students.
Yes.
Do you think it would have made a difference if you done it earlier from first year students? And what I'm thinking about in particular is that by the time they get to fourth year, they've already, so say their brain is kind of
Yes.
formatted. They have certain expectations of what to expect.
Right.
I wonder
Yep.
if that might influence the results. And then kind of connected, have you thought about the learning styles of different students and how would you?
Yep, so I think your first point is really a really interesting one, because you're right. By the time they get to fourth year, they've figured out how to do this thing called university. And then they get exposed to this sort of very different way, which in a sense is encouraging them to sort of relearn how to learn all over again. And some of them don't like that. Absolutely. And sort of that's sort of what I was getting at in talking about sort of that conflict between the two very different approaches to assessment, and students have to adjust to that and adapt to that. So I think your idea of doing it earlier absolutely works. It's a little bit harder, I think, to implement earlier on grading, and I'm still trying to figure out how to implement it, because students are coming in, they're not necessarily mature, they don't necessarily have some of the learning skills that this absolutely don't have some of the learning skills that the fourth years do. So finding a way to make the ungrading work in those earlier years is something that I'm still working on. Have I answered it?
Yeah, no,
Awesome. More questions? Awesome.
Thank you for the very nice topic. My question is it like because we didn't find the difference like with the Byrne product? Is it due to the limitation or the lack of the study, like maybe number of student involvement, the background of the student, for example, what kind of student are they, and where they came from, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
So,
sorry.
yeah, are those things are affecting maybe the outcome, or is there any, because I think if student, for example, from 1 to 4 years, expect more exposure to the traditional grading,
Yeah.
there is no way somebody will tell you about the alternative.
Mhm.
They like it.
Mhm.
So, for example, I like that.
Yeah.
Than the alternative grading. So, you know, is that kind of thing that you look into it, or just
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I should have made clearer is that the students who were doing both classes were essentially the same group of students. So they were our graduating students in our kinesiology program. So they were essentially the same students. One of the limitations that we had is that we made our survey, and Qualitrix newbie, we made our survey totally anonymous, so we couldn't link or create our posts. To see if we actually could track the differences between the students. So that's what I was talking about as sort of a limitation with the Qualitrix data. But we actually had the same, it was essentially the same group of students who were doing both. Who did both courses.
Great. Well, that's our time. Thank you so much, Jeannette. Very good.
Thanks very much. Before I get into this, I wanted to say I encountered something similar from the last presentation when I was teaching my first time. I wanted to experiment with flipped classroom. This was at University of Saskatchewan, but I didn't want to do it for the whole course. So I said, okay, I'll do 1 week in flipped classroom, and at the end, I'll ask students what they thought. And overwhelmingly, they said they preferred the traditional weeks where I had sort of explained things first, and then they could go to the books for supplements. So it could be that I was experienced with that, or because they were first-year students. I don't know, but I was surprised in a similar way that I didn't see a little bit more excitement around the alternative approach. Anyways, my presentation is called Agile Reflection, Ensuring Students Are Actually Learning and Continually. Hold on, there we go. So I'll have 3 parts to my presentation. One is a little bit about me. Then I'll do an introduction to reflection and agility in teaching. And most of the presentation will be examples and outcomes of me experimenting with the combination of those 2 approaches. So I'm at Grenfell campus. I'm with the Environmental Policy Institute. I'm an assistant professor. There are 4 core members of the Environmental Policy Institute, 4 core faculty, and I am one of them. Our website's there if you are interested. So the main research interest that I have is community engaged research. So it almost doesn't matter specifically what the research is about. If it's about sort of something related to sustainability and it's in collaboration with a partner, then I'm interested. But I often do a lot of stuff around waste and renewable energy. I serve as, I have service roles for 2 of our programs, and these are 2 graduate programs I'm affiliated with. So one is the Master of Arts in Environmental Policy. So I teach in that program, and I'm the internship officer. And then TURSU is the Transdisciplinary Sustainability PhD program. So I teach in that program, and I'm also the graduate officer. So I regularly teach 3 courses: Environmental Policy 6002, which is a research design course for master's students; Environmental Policy 6001, which is sort of an applied problem solving course for master's student; and then Transdisciplinary Sustainability 7002, which is basically transdisciplinary methods. So sort of the other core course that I don't teach is kind of sustainability theory. And then the one I teach is around sort of transdisciplinary research methods. So introduction to reflection and agile teaching. You've everyone's been talking about COLD, I assume, at the various sessions here and there, but the idea of incorporating reflection into teaching is really not that new. Although I think, at least my own impression is that it's often underused by many instructors, probably not those of us who are thinking about sort of pedagogy and scholarship of teaching and learning a lot, but for those who spend most of their scholarly work sort of in their field, and then they teach from their field, and maybe don't think as reflexively about how to teach. I suspect reflection is used less often, but we do a lot of experiential learning at Grenfell campus. There's a lot of it involved with my courses. We do a lot of sort of partner projects within the courses, and I always make sure to include the reflective piece after the concrete experience piece. So reflection is a common part of my research practice, making room for students to think about what they did, what that meant to them, and what they learned, strengths and weaknesses they identified for themselves, and that sort of thing. And as for agility in teaching, there's a fair bit of scholarship around this. It's often called agile in teaching, but for me, that sort of hits the ear wrong, so I call it agility in teaching. It comes from software development originally, but there's a piece here, Krebeel et al. 2017, where they came up with sort of a manifesto for agile teaching. And it means a lot of things. It means sort of often more collaboration, more adaptability, more focus on outcomes, like all things that sound very good. But for me, when I talk about agility, in teaching, what I mean is something that's adaptable and iterative. So where you don't always know exactly what you're going to do as you go into the class or into the course, and then you adapt based on student suggestions or on student needs or based on this back and forth that you would have with students. So for me, whenever there's that iteration, sort of back and forth or repeatedly coming back to the same concepts or ideas, we can call that agility if it's meant to sort of make room for not moving on until everyone is comfortable and gets it, and then being willing to move on instead of just moving forward at a regular schedule. So I've just put little asterisks around the parts of these frameworks that I tend to use myself. This is sort of a roughshod. This is just kind of what I do, right? There isn't a deliberate theoretical approach here, but these are some of the relevant areas. So let me go through a couple of examples, and for each of those, I'll talk about the goal of what I was trying to do, the sorts of technology and tools that I used, and the outcome. So first is from the research design course that I teach. I use a tool called Learning Logs, which is a 3-question response sheet or log that I ask each student to fill out at the end of every class. Now, these are once a week, 3-hour-long classes. So just to let you know, that's sort of like 12 of these, maybe over the course of the term, not 35 of them. And the point of that is because this is a course where I really wanted to make sure that by the end, the students really understood the material, that they felt familiar with how to set up a research methodology, how to understand reading a research report or a journal article, just that they really had these competencies that are essential for moving on to do, thesis work or something like that. And to me, it would be sort of a disaster if I couldn't accomplish that, because then students would go off and there'd be so much more learning that they were left to do during the thesis process. So seeing it as really important and knowing that students struggle in particular with some of the earlier parts of sort of the methodology flow chart, making sure we had an opportunity for them to indicate what they did or didn't learn, and indicate action that they would take to learn more. And you can see the questions there, but I won't read through all of them because I have 4 examples I want to get through. What I found this useful for was quick clarification. So each week I could read the previous week's reflections, and then I would know, this is tripping people up. Let me spend a little bit of time on this at the beginning of this class. And also generally lets me take the class's temperature in terms of whether they're feeling comfortable with something or not. So I found that to be quite effective. Another tool I use is called Agile Review. I use this in all courses, but basically that review class that we often put at the end of any course, which is sort of, does anybody have questions? Which is fine. I approach that a little bit differently, where I'll walk through each of the course outcomes that I assigned in the syllabus. And for each of those, I'll say, all right, this is sort of what we covered. What questions do people have? We'll go back and forth, and then I'll kind of poll the class. I'll give them different colored sticky notes, and we'll do kind of a traffic light thing. Green is sort of, yep, let's move on. Yellow is, I'm kind of uncomfortable. And red is, we got to stop. I don't get it, before we move on. And we can do that online as well. During COVID, I would use you could put these little like sort of emojis almost next to your name on a bright space meeting, so they could put like a happy face if they were ready to move on, or a little flatline face if they were feeling more of a yellow light. So the reason I did this is because, again, really wanting to make sure that by the end of the course I had achieved the course outcomes, and taught difficult and important concepts to the students. And I found generally I get very positive student evaluations approaching things this way. The course outcomes are aligned into the course, they're approached again. And generally, I'm getting positive student evaluations, which are related to that activity. These first 2 tools really build into each other, so they can look over the learning logs that they've put together as they come up with their questions for the last class to make sure we really did revisit anything they weren't comfortable with. I'll probably spend the least time on this one. So I do group projects for the applied course that I do. So we do one set of projects at the municipal level and one set of projects at the provincial level. They're all group projects. There's less innovation here, but basically I ask students to give me an individual private reflection after each of those projects. It's iterative in the sense that we do 2 projects, so they can compare their experiences between the 2 group projects and say, I was in this role this time, and this time I tried something different. So it gives them a little bit more opportunity for reflection, but it's not as iterative as some of the other models that I'm using. So for me, it shows a lot of evidence of learning, and that sort of comparative thing is a bit of a side effect. That wasn't necessarily the intent. I did the reflections because I needed to know what happened in each group, but they really showed some interesting learning and comparison. It gave me additional feedback on the course. This is the newest one and the one I think I'm the most excited about. So in the PhD level course I teach, we use a moderated Brightspace forum where students are expected to submit reflections each week, but it's moderated so they can say, do not approve this post to me or my co-instructor. And that means we'll just read it. We won't make it public. So this gives them room to reflect privately to us if they want to, but for the most part, the default is to reflect publicly so everyone can see what each person is reflecting on for the course. And it was really important in this case because here we're trying to build a skill set that is really hard to just teach through lecture. We wanted to teach students how to appreciate perspectives of other disciplines, how to listen more than they speak, how to be honest with sharing their own perspectives. These are things that are hard to just sort of sit down and lecture to someone. So we give students the opportunity to practice those skills and then reflect on them. And we see a lot of iterative improvement in terms of the reflections over the timing of the course, and some spillover benefits in that one of the longer reflection exercises we did in that course was the students were incredibly thorough and enthusiastic with what they said in that, and we could really get an opportunity to talk with each of them about it. I'm not going to have time, I think, to go into these emerging lessons, so I think I'll just put that slide up there, and if anyone wants to ask me questions about those emerging lessons, they can, but I'll stop things there. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you, Garrett. Right on time. Gives us 5 minutes for questions. So I'll put it out to the guests here. Anyone has a question for Garrett?
Hello, I really enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering if you thought also this like teaching method, it could also only be used with like mature students.
If it would be suitable for mature students?
No, it would only work with grad students and not like.
That's a good question. And true, my sort of sample size is a bit limited here because I only teach at the graduate level. But I have done reflective activities sort of before this current position in some other classes. And I find that reflection, the point there I made about it being light work, I think is fair in a sense, in that usually when you ask students to sit down and sort of just like put down what they're thinking, it's a little easier for them to do than to sort of craft, an essay and that sort of thing. So I don't think so necessarily. It would only be suitable for graduate students. But the level that I did it at here is maybe more appropriate for graduate students. Like I'm not totally sure I would do like a weekly log for undergrads, but it would depend on what you're teaching them. I think for some topics that could still be very appropriate if that's sort of a bulk of the learning objective or the learning tool.
Okay, I think we have a question online. You can go ahead with your question.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this question, thank you very much, Garrett. That was a very useful talk and very enlightening. Yes, for the reflections, and so you do them on a weekly basis, I think. Maybe just to follow up on the previous question, do you think that would work in terms of like maybe a broader reflection halfway through, or maybe like on a quarterly basis, like some of the concepts the students learned in the semester thus far, in the course thus far?
Yeah, I think so. So for me, the critical piece is that we're making space for students to reflect and really think about what they know and what they don't know, what they've understood and what they're struggling with, and the fact that there's some iteration to that. So I don't think it matters as much if it's every week or every class or sort of 2 or 3 times during the course. I think both of those could work and both of those could give some benefits, but it's definitely a lot more, I think it's stronger when it's more frequent because it gives you more of an opportunity to react to what students are saying and gives them an opportunity to adjust, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't bother doing it if you can't do it every week. Right? So even the 6001 example, there's only 2 opportunities to reflect, but I still think it's really valuable. And I see a lot of difference between reflection 1 and reflection 2 that I find very interesting.
Great. Thank you again, Garrett. Very good presentation. Thank you very much.
I'm often worried that I'm Wimp Low. If anybody's familiar with Kung Pao, it's like a 90s parody of a action combat movie where they deliberately trained Wimp Low incorrectly as a joke. So I'm never sure when I show up that this is going to be the time that they say, we're going to let you in on the joke. But I've loved the presentation so far. It seems like I'm in good company in terms of trying to work towards iterative evaluation, what Garrett just mentioned. And this is actually a much simpler, perhaps, innovation, if you can call it that, than what my compatriots have presented so far. So we'll see. But the presentation, as was just described, is another chance turning summative exams into formative opportunities with what I call follow-ups. And so I'm going to fly through things. Like I said, it's pretty simple, but I'm really curious as to what the audience thinks of this idea. So this all started with a simple, I've been a student for a long, long time. I'm still a PhD candidate, and I started my undergrad in 2007. So I've taken a total of 86 courses so far. I don't recall if that includes the ones that I've had to take a couple of times. So it might be more than that. But when I started teaching, I realized that I'm not sure if I've ever really been given a real formative evaluation. And so I looked into this a little bit in preparation for this this presentation. I looked into what exactly the differences between summative and formative evaluations are, maybe trying to figure out why formative evaluations, as they are defined formally, are so rare. And so Madalena, I think, Taras, did a couple of the seminal pieces of work on summative versus formative in the modern education system. And what I experienced, the lack of formative assessments, is not actually that surprising. She studied the perceptions and realities of formative versus summative feedback in a bunch of instructors, and found that only a small percentage of lecturers mentioned feedback in either their definition or examples of formative assessment, despite the fact that feedback is a key aspect of doing formative assessment. And she says this is perhaps one of the most disturbing findings of the study. And so this is not drawing on too many formal definitions. I'm going to present just a comparison of formative versus summative from my perspective of what's important on these two. Formative assessments should be informative, right? The whole point of these is that they provide feedback. They should be part of the learning process, and they should therefore be explicit. Students should have an explicit chance to figure out what they're getting wrong in a learning experience. Whereas summative, obviously, are summarizing learning. The purpose is for us as educators to assess the learning that our students have achieved. Therefore, it should be at the end of a learning process, maybe not at the end of a course, but it should be at the end of when we expect students have done enough to learn something. And so therefore, it's actually kind of, if you think about it, too late. If you're giving summative assessments, it's kind of too late to give students feedback. And so one last point that I would sort of underscore is that formative assessments shouldn't be consequential. If you're trying to teach students to give feedback to students, so that they correct what they've been learning and they correct a mistake that they have in their head about the content, then making that consequential kind of ruins the point. And so what I've been experimenting with, I'm jumping ahead. So before we get there, why does this duality exist at all? And in developing this concept of follow-ups, I've been trying to think about the education system and everything we do inside it as a system of technology. And we design technology, so I'm actually formally a management information systems researcher, I guess. We design technologies with goals and constraints. And so I started wondering what goal or constraint causes formative evaluations or assessments to be so rare, at least in my experience, and summative to be so common. And I think it boils down to time. If you think about it, the ideal educational experience is a really brilliant instructor who knows everything about a topic, sitting down with a student who might know nothing and iterating with them over and over and over again forever until that student knows as much as the educator. But obviously, we teach our courses within the constraints of a term. We have so many students and only so many opportunities, therefore, to actually provide knowledge to them, to create experiences for them to learn that knowledge, and then to assess that. So time becomes a key constraint. So how might we create formative assessments without taking up more time? Maybe that's the solution. And how might we encourage students to learn from the summative experiences that they have that we need to do in order to assess that they're actually learning what we want them to learn? So that's where the concept of follow-ups comes from. And so this is a lot of text on one slide. It's the exact instructions that I give students when I create these follow-ups. It's basically this: for a few bonus marks on a previous multiple choice exam, select a number of questions that were marked incorrect and write a written explanation of up to 300 words, either providing a justified rationale explaining what the correct answers should be or are, or you explain what you chose and why it should be marked correct. You find references to justify your choices. And key to that is providing citations and references using appropriate formatting. And so this is just it's not a cherry-picked example. It's just a convenience sample of what this might look like. I know you can't read it, The point is to say, the question was, which of the following are system factors that matter in user interaction with AI-enabled systems? There's 5 options, and this particular student says, I chose this and this, but if you look at the course reading titled User Interaction with AI-Enabled Systems, well, here's the characteristics that they describe. Here are the system factors, that I should have chosen. And this would have been a simple way of for that student to get full marks on this bonus mark. So if we look at, again, that difference between formative and summative, the whole point here is to take what is normally a summative assessment, a midterm exam that's assessing the end of a chapter or something like that, and it tries to get rid of this idea that it's too late for feedback and instead makes that midterm exam part of the learning process. It kind of creates an incentive for students to really look deeply at the feedback, and then it also removes the consequences of getting something wrong because they can go back through and recover marks that they've lost by providing an explanation that should be pretty simple for them to do because they know now what the answer is, and they can therefore gain those marks back. So if I do a formative assessment of follow-ups, my perspective is that these things seem easy to do and they are certainly easy to grade. So in terms of that constraint of time, I don't actually lose a lot of time when I engage in grading in these because, again, I know what the answers are. Students are generally submitting things that are very sort of form-fitted to what is needs to be interpreted. And I'll caveat, I did a quick informal survey. It's confounded by all kinds of things, but students do seem to be appreciating this approach. They are experiencing, apparently, less stress, more learning, and equivalent grades to midterms that they say they haven't done with this kind of a style. Some weird findings is that only about half of students do these things. I don't know why. It should be a really easy thing for them to do, but for some reason, lots of students leave the bonus marks on the table. And some students tend, instead of doing what I've asked them to do, they tend to simply explain their mistakes. Oh, I was thinking about this incorrectly, and then they don't say anymore. So there's a metacognitive aspect of this that I haven't quite figured out yet, and maybe with better sort of instruction, these students wouldn't take that approach. So I think then this is my last slide. I think the takeaway is iterative evaluation, what Garrett actually just mentioned. This idea that, well, can we find a way for students to have multiple chances to obtain learning outcomes? And follow-ups might be one of them. Maybe it's completely flawed, and I'd love to hear why. But I'm wondering if there's more to this that we can work on to try and find ways to do iterative evaluation. And the reason why I'm excited about this is because I think given access to modern learning management systems and so on, maybe we can start to think about escaping some of the old architectures of education, the semesterly structure that we have, especially to get students through a lot of the basic knowledge and especially undergraduate degrees. Is there a way of restructuring this so that students can progress through what might be called settled knowledge at their own speed and at their own pace with as much instruction as possible and with as many opportunities as possible to demonstrate their learning without consequence for failure. So I'll pause there. Hopefully I made some sense. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Garrett. We have about 5 minutes, or 7 for questions. I'll have one question here.
So working?
Yeah.
Okay. Brian, for the presentation, you mentioned that the formative assessments are easy to grade. Did you mean relative to something else, or because my intuition tells me this would be significantly harder for lecturers to do. The traditional model itself puts a lot of pressure from a grading point of view, and I'm wondering, this is a no-brainer from a student's point of view, but how do we convince instructors to adopt it if it takes more of their time? Secondly, are there any tools that you are already familiar with that makes this process easier? And thirdly, lastly, what's the font on your slides? They're really good.
So I missed that last thing. I know it was probably about the aesthetics of the slides. Is that right?
What the font was?
The font. Oh, yeah. I have to look it up. I think it's IBM, Plex, Serif, and Inter are the 2 that I'm working with. But thanks, I try. As for the questions about these follow-ups, in my experience, they're really easy and quick to grade because, again, the student knows what the right answers are. So it's almost like it's so rare that a student has put down something that's impossible to interpret and sort of find the right answer in their work, right? They very easily can say like, you know, the answers are here because here's the reference. And so there's still the odd, and I've run this, I should have mentioned, I've run follow-ups in 4 courses now, maybe 5, across the last 3 to 4 years. And there is the odd student who just like totally doesn't get it, and you kind of have to read through their work and try to make sense of what they're trying to do in order to give them grades. But generally, when somebody does this really well, it's really quick and easy to get through. And it doesn't take much more time than grading the average midterm exam. In terms of tools, I don't know of any. I use Brightspace's rubrics system pretty excessively, maybe is the word. So every single one of these goes through a simple sort of, there's up to 2 marks for getting the answers exactly right, and up to 2 marks for getting the references exactly right. And that's what I use when I grade these. So I can fly through them. So it doesn't take that long.
Thanks, Ryan. That was a really, really interesting way of looking at text and whatnot. A question for you. So just for the mechanics of it. So do the students get to choose the question they, and then so can they do 1? Can they do 2? Do you give them the opportunity to respond to more than 1?
Right. It's a great question. Generally I let them recover up to almost 20% of a midterm. So if they've gotten it wrong, I'll sort of calculate the number of questions on the exam over how much. I forget exactly what my calculation is, but I just work it out so that they can choose, say, up to 4 or up to 5. If it's a 20 to 25 question exam, they can respond to 4 or 5 questions in order to recover about 20% of the marks that the midterm was worth. And so I don't know exactly why. That's really arbitrary. It's one of the things that I'm struggling with about this idea, is how to fit it within what I see as some of the defaults of education or of academia, right? I don't want to let them recover the whole exam, and yet I don't know why that is. I probably could see an argument for just letting students write a midterm and then simply correct every single thing they got wrong. And that would probably be an interesting test case at least, right? But I don't know exactly why I don't do that by default. I'm curious if folks in the room have an opinion on that.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, it's just talking about alternate grading, right? And that idea of revising and redoing and resubmitting. And so that's where I was sort of going is, you know, do you cap it and why do you cap it? But I think you've already answered. Really interesting talk. Thanks.
I have one other question, Ryan, and on my way, I'll apologize for calling you Garrett earlier.
Garrett does have his hand up too. I don't know if we'll have time for that.
So I have just a couple of questions. And one of them is just a kind of a follow-up from the previous question, is like, why don't we let them kind of redo the whole thing? In the back of my head, it just sprang, it's like cheating, right? So if you just allow somebody to just go and just basically redo everything, so then basically it depends on what you're evaluating and how you're evaluating it, so that let's say it may or may not become cheating if they already know the answer. So then it's kind of irrelevant to ask the question again. So that's one aspect to it. But then the other aspect that came to my mind when you were speaking, like, it was the fact that during COVID, like, we actually allowed students to drop their courses like later than in the regular drop date for avoiding to fail a course. And so after COVID, we kind of took that away. And I feel that like there is value in what you're saying about the reflection aspect of the learning. So I feel that a student may kind of like may benefit from being able to drop later in the course, because they may reflect that they actually have not learned, and then maybe they could be given a chance to learn this in the next time around. So I really find that maybe there could be an argument for saying a student could be actually, let's say, should be or allowed to drop later in the term than our regular early drop days to avoid academic prejudice. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, both great questions. I'll just focus on that last one because I think it comments on, again, the thing that I'm chasing here is like, why do we do any of these things? And most of it kind of boils down to, well, we need to do what we do within 3.5 month semester, and we don't have an easier way or an existing system to adopt in order to get students through this in any other way. We have to do semesters, so therefore we have to like teach students within a semester and test them within a semester, and if they don't get that, then there's consequences. And so there's real questions. You raised the question of cheating with your earlier question. And the interrogation I would put on that is like, well, let's define cheating. Like, what is cheating if a student has done some deep work in order to understand what those authors in that paper that I mentioned viewed as the user interface elements of interacting with AI? You know, like if a student got that wrong on a midterm because they were flying through it and they were stressed and they were struggling with just like all the other pressures that they're usually dealing with. And then they go away and they sit down and they read that paper in a deeper way. It's like, isn't that what we want? Isn't that brilliant? But it goes back to that constraint of like, how do we do that and then grade that within the time limits that we have within the structures of a semester? So I don't think I've answered your question, but hopefully my ramble has been informative anyway, or formative.
Okay, Brian, I think we have one more question online. If you put it in the chat, we only have we have to move on to other sessions. Comment on that question?
I'm reading.
Up there on the screen.
So Garrett's asking about papers. So that question, I'll read it out for everybody, is have you experimented with this model for non-exam assessments like papers? My courses use a lot of papers and it's slower to mark them than exams. So would the effectiveness be limited? It's a good question. And this is what I mean by the other approaches or other ways of adopting this concept of allowing students to follow up and iterate. Certainly, if somebody gets something wrong in a paper, and you're following this kind of concept of follow-ups, they should be able to recover that somehow. But it totally is a different question of it's easy to separate a midterm multiple choice question out into the parts of the question that the students got wrong. When grading a paper, I think it's harder to separate out those pieces in order to actually ask students to follow up on that. I can imagine a scenario in which in the feedback as you're writing it to a student, you say this core concept that you sort of held as true in your paper is actually not, you're not understanding that properly. Please go revise that. But that is so costly in terms of time, I imagine. And so it's that question of how do we make this easy for instructors to do well? And I don't know.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. Really, really great presentation.